Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into an ancient textual mystery that actually escalates into the high-stakes crossfire of modern religious debate. We're going to be looking at ancient manuscripts, totally hypothetical documents, and how they are literally weaponized in today's theological arguments.
So, what if a foundational text of the world's largest religion doesn't actually exist? It's kind of a mind-blowing thought, right? How could a purely hypothetical document possibly shape the beliefs of billions of people? Or, on the flip side, be used to try and dismantle those very same beliefs? Well, it happens every single day in the world of biblical scholarship and apologetics. And to really understand how, we've got to look back at a 2,000-year-old puzzle.
Okay, let's dive into this. Scholars have known for a long time that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a ton of the exact same stories, often word for word. They call this the triple tradition. But there's a fascinating twist. Matthew and Luke also share roughly 250 verses. These are mostly sayings of Jesus, things like the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer, that are completely absent from Mark. So figuring out exactly how Matthew and Luke got this shared material, well, that's what scholars call the synoptic problem.
To solve this massive puzzle, modern scholars came up with a theory. They proposed that there was a lost, unseen document which they decided to call Q. That just comes from quell, which is the German word for source. The whole idea is that both Matthew and Luke independently use the Gospel of Mark for their narrative structure, but they use this invisible Q document for the actual sayings of Jesus. It's a really neat, highly mathematical solution to a super complex literary puzzle.
Section 1. The invisible Q source. But right here is where our historical detective story hits a major snag. Let's look at the hard evidence. On one side, we have the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For these, we literally have thousands of ancient manuscripts and fragments. They're heavily quoted by early church fathers and officially acknowledged by early Christian councils. But then on the flip side, we have the Q source. The number of manuscripts? 0. Number of fragments? Absolutely 0. Mentions by early church fathers? 0. It exists entirely in the mathematical reconstructions of modern critics. As some historians point out, if a tiny, inconsequential letter like Philemon survived, how in the world could an immeasurably important document like Q just vanish without a single historical trace? Section 2. Enter the Didache. Because of this staggering lack of evidence, a lot of researchers started looking elsewhere for something tangible. And that brings us to the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This is an actual historically verified Christian text from the 1st century. It was completely lost for centuries until a copy was discovered in a library back in 1873. It's full of instructions for early church practices and ethical teachings. And the absolutely crucial thing here, it doesn't just exist in theory. We can actually hold it, we can read it, and we can verify it. And this brilliantly illustrates why this matters so much. When scholars actually compare the Didache with the Gospels, they find these remarkable structural parallels. For example, the Didache uses this two ways framework, the way of life and the way of death, which perfectly aligns with the ethical teachings found in Matthew's famous Sermon on the Mount. Because of this, a growing number of historical scholars now argue that Matthew and Luke might have just directly used the tangible Didache as a source, rather than some invisible Q document. And if that's true, the very foundation of the whole Q hypothesis really starts to crumble. Section 3. Modern Apologetic Battlegrounds. So we are now shifting from a historical detective story straight into a modern courtroom drama. Section 4. The Johannine Thunderbolts. You see, some Islamic apologists and secular critics love to use the idea of Q to argue that the earliest followers of Jesus just saw him as a normal human prophet, or maybe a wise sage. And they do this primarily because the reconstructed Q doesn't explicitly focus on the crucifixion or resurrection. But Christian apologists flip this script entirely. They apply what's called an all-or-nothing principle. Basically, if you're going to accept Q as a reliable source, they argue, you have to accept all of it. And Q contains a massive theological landmine. Take a listen to this passage, found in both Matthew 11:27 and Luke 10:22. Source critics place this squarely in the earliest, most primitive layer of the Q material. Jesus says, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." I'll just let the sheer weight of that exclusive claim settle for a second. So the crucial point is how Christian apologists utilize this verse. They argue that this single, isolated saying in Q establishes things that are literally impossible for a mere mortal prophet to claim.
First off, it shows exclusive mutual knowledge, basically placing Jesus on the exact same ontological plane as God the Father. Second, it claims absolute sovereign prerogative, meaning Jesus alone gets to choose who receives divine revelation. And third, it uses the absolute, totally unique title of the Son. Apologists argue this undeniably proves that the absolute earliest layers of Jesus' teachings included claims to full-blown divinity.
Section 5. The Son of Man. And the apologetic argument certainly doesn't stop there. Let's look at another really vital piece of the puzzle. The specific title Jesus prefers to use for himself within the Q material, the Son of Man. Now, some critics claim Son of Man just means, a normal human being, but apologists trace a direct linguistic continuity to show it's actually a profound anchor to Jewish eschatology. Back in the Hebrew Bible's book of Daniel, chapter 7, the prophet sees this heavenly figure, one like a son of man, which in the Aramaic text is bar anish. Fast forward to the Greek New Testament, and this is translated exactly as hos, huios, and yerobu. Even highly revered medieval Jewish scholars, like Rashi, explicitly confirmed that this specific figure in Daniel 7 is the King Messiah, coming on the clouds of heaven to claim an eternal throne.
But here is the kicker. This heavenly Son of Man in Daniel 7 is given dominion and a kingdom so that all nations and languages should serve or worship him. The specific Aramaic word used right there is palach. In all of biblical literature, palach is exclusively reserved for the worship of deity. It's not used for humans. So apologists argue that by repeatedly adopting the Son of Man title found in Q, Jesus wasn't just calling himself a regular guy. He was explicitly claiming a divine prerogative and the absolute right to be worshipped.
Section 6. The Evidence of Shirk.
This brings us to what Christian apologists consider the ultimate trap for Islamic critics who try to use the hypothetical Q source to argue against Orthodox Christianity. In strict Islamic theology, there is an absolutely unforgivable sin called shirk, which is the sin of associating partners with Allah. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how apologists point out that if a critic accepts Q as the most authentic early record of Jesus, they are inadvertently validating a text that clearly commits shirk and basically obliterates Islamic theology. Within the Q material, Jesus claims eschatological authority, literally declaring himself the final judge of all humanity, whose own word determines a person's eternal fate before the angels. Plus, in Q, Jesus accepts the title Lord or Kyrios and demands unquestioning obedience. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you?" Apologists argue these are demands for a level of absolute submission that Islam reserves strictly and solely for Allah.
So we've seen how a completely hypothetical document built entirely on mathematical deduction sits at the absolute center of modern religious debates. Whether Q is just an invisible, flawed theory, or whether the tangible historical Didache is the real solution to the puzzle, it is absolutely fascinating to see how apologists use the very tools of secular textual criticism to fiercely defend the earliest claims of Christianity. It leaves us with a pretty profound question to ponder today. If a reconstructed, unseen document can both build and completely obliterate entire modern theologies, what is the true foundation of faith? Is it the mathematical models of modern scholars, or is it the tangible texts that have actually survived the millennia? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me today. Keep asking those great questions, and we'll see you on the next one.